My name is Joe Schwartzberg. I've been a professor at one place or another since 1960 when I got my doctorate at the University of Wisconsin. I first taught at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, and then I came here into Minnesota in 1964. And I've also taught at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi as a Fulbright professor in 1979-80. And my principal fields of interest have been South Asia, which means the Indian subcontinent essentially, and political geography as an applied discipline, and something that's a little esoteric, the history of cartography and historical cartography. So I've worked in a lot of different areas, but those would cover most of it. Oh, and since my retirement in 2000, I focused on how to create structures that would promote the cause of peace on Earth. And I didn't start in 2000, but I've made that my principal focus since my retirement in that year. And I had written a number of pieces related to global governance before then.
So, since we know you as a peace activist, we would like to hear more about your contributions towards the theme of peace. You said you wrote some of the books.
Well, I've written a number of books. I don't know if I can. Here's one called Revitalizing the United Nations. It was published through the World Federalist Movement, and that deals mainly with the subject, the need for weighted voting. And I've written a book on creating a United Nations Parliamentary Assembly so that the people of the world will have a place within the United Nations system. The UN Charter begins with the words, "We the peoples," and then people have forgotten thereafter, after the first sentence of the Charter, that you won't find the word people or peoples in the Charter after the preamble. So there's a profound democratic deficit in the United Nations. It's an organization of nations rather than of people or peoples. So that's something that should be corrected. Then I expanded that, or these ideas, or a bunch of ideas that I'd been thinking about through over decades, and I wrote this book called Transforming the United Nations System, Designs for a Workable World, which was published by the United Nations University Press in November of 2013. And I'm seeing that gets distributed to all the UN missions sometime this month. It should be at least one copy, and usually two, and in some cases 3 copies for each UN mission, so that they will have the idea of a great many ideas that are original in this work about not reforming the United Nations, but transforming it, because it's based on an outmoded paradigm. That's the paradigm of the Westphalian state system, which dates from 1648, from the Treaty of Westphalia, which ended the 30 Years' War. But that's almost 500 years old. It's time to update our thinking about how to organize global governance. So the idea is that global problems require global solutions. There are a lot of problems in the world. For example, climate change is an excellent example, which nations cannot possibly solve on their own. The whole ecosystem of our planet does not respect international boundaries. Groundwater flows across national boundaries. The atmosphere blankets all countries in the world. The ocean bathes all the shores. So it's a global problem, and global problems require global solutions. So I deal with how to have global solutions. Global solutions presumes the creation of global institutions, of which the UN is one example, but they're very deficient because they are based on the stupid idea of one nation, one vote. If you take the least populous country in the world, which most people couldn't find on a map, Nauru its population is 9,300 people, and that's China has almost 1.5 million times as many people. 150,000 times as many people as Nauru, but they each have one vote not only in the General Assembly, but in all other organs of the United Nations system, except for the only organ that really matters, which is the Security Council, which has another stupid system of representation, which could be corrected, but there are dozens of proposals other than my own for improving the Security Council, but they're all based on the faulty thinking of the Treaty of Westphalia. So anyway, I go into all that in this book and present a lot of specific examples. For example, on the cover here is a system of representation in the Security Council through only 12 member regions, rather than enlarging the Security Council to add anywhere from 1 to 10 additional states. This would reduce the Security Council from 15 to 12 members, but everybody in the world would be represented, which the Security Council never came close to doing in all its history. At most, it's represented 56% of the people of the world. So right now, there's no reason why all the world can't be represented, but you have to have a decision-making design. And so I call it Designs for a Workable World, because I believe that the quality and the legitimacy of decisions that decision-making agencies make has a lot to do with the design of the system. So design is a very important consideration in my way of thinking about the world.
So from the maps which you just displayed, I could see the world has been divided into 12 regions.
And the vote that they cast is weighted based on their population and economic productivity. And in a legal fiction called, like the legal fiction of the Sovereign Equality of Nations, the equal worth of all regional perspectives. So that's a new legal fiction. So there's a mathematical formula, quite simple, which will give you these numbers, so that the most weighty region would be Europe with 16.9% of the total vote, and the least would be what I call the Westminster League, or Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the 12 island states of the Pacific Islands Forum. So that would be about a weight of 4.5. So the region with the greatest vote would have less than 4 times as great a weight as the Westminster League. But that's a ballpark figure. Those are figures that are workable. Where in place of the one nation, one vote. The least populous country ever to be a member of the Security Council was Malta, with 250,000 people. But when Malta was on the Security Council, its vote counted the same as China, with at that time perhaps 400 or 500 million people. There's no rhyme or reason to it. So.
But then we can see that countries which don't enjoy friendly relations amongst themselves have been placed into one group. For example, Iran and Iraq are there in one group. How would they agree to send one representative?
They're in one group right now. There are caucuses for choosing the membership of the of the United Nations. They are in one group.
Yes.
So, but it's not quite as disparate a group as the one that exists, which is the Asian Caucus. The Middle East and North African Caucus. So they're a part of that caucus.
Okay. Let's see how the book is received. We hope it's a good work.
Anyway, I deal with that problem. It's an obvious problem, so you're correct to point it out. But so there are a lot of obvious problems, and then you do the best you can to answer those objections in a pragmatic way. We live in an imperfect world, so.
But then we see that even in America, we see states having the same weightage when it comes to Senate, U.S. Senate. The most populous and the least populous having the same weight over there. So how do you see that?
Well, I think that's an aspect of our Constitution which is questionable. Why should the it's about 35 million people of California have no more say in the Senate than the 400,000 people. It's more or less 400,000 in Wyoming, and the ratio between the two is, I think, 57 to 1, in that ballpark. So it made sense at the time our nation was founded, because if we hadn't created what that's called the Connecticut Compromise, and for people who are not familiar with American history, if we didn't have the Connecticut Compromise, we wouldn't have a country today. But at that time, the disparity between Virginia, the most populous state, and Delaware, the least populous, was about 10 to 1. So 10 to 1 is significantly different from 57 to 1. So the Constitution was brilliantly designed to serve the needs of that time, but it hasn't always kept up with the changing nature of demographics and politics and and the economy. So it's still a good Constitution, but not as good in some respects as it was when it was created, and better in other respects, obviously, because the Constitution sanctioned slavery, which is no longer sanctionable. Anyway.
But then we see that this anomaly in Senate has been addressed by creating a House of Representatives.
That was done at the same time.
Yes, that was done at the same time. So can we apply this idea in UN some way, having two different houses, one on the basis of population, that can be a people's assembly, the other the state's assembly?
That's why I wrote this book about creating a world parliamentary assembly. This would represent people, and the General Assembly represents states. That's the present situation. But I would say that even in the General Assembly representing states, when you have disparities as great as that between Nauru with 9,300 people and China with 1.4 billion people, you can't argue credibly for sovereign equality, one nation, one vote. It doesn't really make any sense. So I have formulae for weighted voting, and which I first presented in this monograph. And so yes, I mean, there are lots of problems, but people have not been thinking very originally or creatively about the solutions to the problems. Someone said that the United Nations is the only place in the universe where inertia breeds its own momentum, and that it's very hard to get people to think outside the box. But you have to think outside the box, or you can't solve the problem.
So your prior writings have been included in this final book. Is that correct?
Well, I don't think anything is final, and the point of this book is to show that that there are solutions. My solutions may or may not be the best solutions, but people say you can't solve the problem. If you say you can't, if you believe you can't, you can't. And once you're in that mindset, you're stuck. But you have to say, well, let's work on the problem and come up with a solution. Professor Schwartzberg has a solution. Maybe we can improve on that one. I don't say that's necessarily the best solution. It's the best I can think of at this point.
That's a great idea. Okay, now that you have written such a good book, what actually was your inspiration or motivation for working for global peace?
I think it's better to live in harmony than to kill one another. It's pretty simple. I think peace is a prerequisite for progress, and instead of spending money on armaments, you can spend money on constructive ends if you learn to live at peace with your neighbor.
But can you recall any single incident and any single inspiration which led you to work on?
No. I first learned of the World Federalist Movement when I was fresh out of college and working on my first job for the United States Army Map Service in Washington in 1949 or 50, I don't remember which year it was. And they had a chapter of the World Federalist Movement there at the church that I then attended. I don't anymore, but I thought, this is an obvious good idea. It's, that we need, if we could achieve peace in the United States or a number of other countries through federal mechanisms, why can't we do it at the global level? So I became a World Federalist almost immediately on learning of the idea. It seemed so obvious to me.
That's great. And now that you've been working on this theme ever since you left college, that's what I understood. So, what do you consider were your biggest successes?
My biggest success? Well, I suppose it's this book. I mean, I've had a number of successes as an academic and working on South Asia. For 14 years, I worked on a historical atlas of South Asia, which was highly acclaimed when it was published, and it was originally published by the University of Chicago Press and then later by Oxford University Press. And that if people who didn't share my interest in world peace were to judge my career, they would probably say that was my greatest success. But I think the ideas in this book are my greatest success.
Okay, so do you think it's through your writings that you have expressed yourself? In other words, what ways and methods worked for you while you were working on the theme of peace?
Keep at it. Don't give up. Apply yourself. That means you have to sacrifice a bit of pleasure here and there because certain things, unless you keep working at it, things don't get done. I have a great many good friends with wonderful ideas, and I belong to a study group, a think tank called World Federalist Institute, and for years they've been talking about the basic premises, and they never get beyond first base. In fact, I'm not even sure they get to first base. But at a certain point, you had to put pen to paper or finger to laptop. Finger to computer, and start churning out stuff, and saying, well, let's make this. Let's give this idea a concrete form so that we can discuss its merits and agree on what the merits are or are not, as the case may be. So it's application.
That's great. So those were your successes. And what were your failures?
My failures?
Yep.
Well, I've been working for more than 15 years now with something called the Kashmir Study Group. It's a group of scholars and diplomats, for the most part, who have some sort of interest in Kashmir and have tried to bring peace to this troubled region, and we haven't succeeded. So I suppose it's not my failure in particular, but it's a failure to achieve what I and others set out to do. Well, you could say it's the failure of India and Pakistan. I mean, that you could argue that point also. But I think there was a time, I won't go into that history, but there was a time when I think we were actually pretty close to success before the overthrow of Musharraf.
Okay, and now that you have started...
By the way, he was very interested in our plans, and he was in regular contact with the head of the Kashmir Study Group.
That's great. So, what, in your opinion, is the best way to resolve Kashmir issue? How durable peace can be achieved in that matter?
There's a model which most people are not aware of how Italy and Austria solved the problem of Tyrol, which is an area, part of which was ceded from Austria-Hungary to Italy after World War I and remained with Italy after World War II. So we have a German-speaking minority, well, it's a majority in parts of Tyrol, but that are ruled by Italy. And it has to do with creating autonomous councils and having successive layers of consultation through autonomous bodies. And it's complicated, and I don't think most of the people who are hearing what I'm talking about would really have a clue as to what it means. But there are some actual successful things. And Tyrol is one of the most prosperous and peaceful areas in the whole of Europe, as well as one of the most beautiful. And it has to do in part with Austria and Italy having decided it's best to have a diplomatic solution rather than a military solution.
So since not many people are aware of this solution, you will have to little more elaborate.
But we have. We've published a lot of papers.
You mean to say that your group recommends an independent Kashmir?
No, I didn't say that. I said autonomous.
Autonomous, with joint control of India and Pakistan?
I beg your pardon?
Joint control of India and Pakistan?
Well, there would be India and Pakistan would remain responsible for defense and foreign policy on their respective sides of the line of control, which I would alter slightly to make it a little bit more rational, but that's a relatively small part of the total problem.
Okay. So that you call your biggest failure. Do you still, now that you have spent so many years in the field of peace, do you have any regret?
People take peace seriously. We glorify war, and we shouldn't. And we have to think of the costs and benefits of different approaches to solving problems at the global level. And it's so obvious that the costs of war are so much greater than the costs of hanging in there and working for peace. The cost and the benefits of peace are so much greater than those that can be won through the agency of war. It ought to be obvious, but humankind has a rather sad history when it comes to war. It has to do perhaps with the genes of the male of our species. I don't know what the cause is, but at any rate, we treat soldiers as if they were doing something noble when most of them are in the army, on the armed forces, because it's a job that offers a great many benefits. And I don't mean to say that there's not an altruistic element in the military service of a number of people. I was in the service for almost 3 years, so I have, and I've, so I think I can speak about the armed forces from an insider's and an outsider's perspective. And I worked for the Army Map Service for 2 years before I actually went into the Army. So I've had 5 years of connection with the U.S. Army. But I think we have to learn the art of peace rather than the art of war.
That's great. And my other question is, we see so many organizations and individuals working for peace in the United States, but we do not see them making a meaningful impact on U.S. policies.
Right, because
what's the reason
they mostly have very short-term horizons. Their interest is in the issue of the day, what to do about Ukraine, what to do about Afghanistan or Iraq. I'm not saying those aren't unimportant things, but someone has to have a larger vision, a vision of how the world ought to be organized. And that's why, I mean, it's maybe boasting, but that's, I think, the merit of this book, that it's based on, or it projects a larger vision.
Okay, and now that the book has come again, have you justified the holding of veto power by United States and other countries in this book? Do you support that?
There's no excuse for the veto, but it's not easy to get rid of. But I offer a number of suggestions for how to minimize the negative impacts of the veto. Of course, if you had 12 regions and differential power in them, in the case of the United States, for example, the weight of the United States, according to my formula, is 12.5%. That's 1/8. So right now we have 6.67% of all the votes in the Security Council. 1/15 is 6.7%. And if we change that to 12.5%, it's almost doubling our weight. So the trade-off, nobody gives up something for nothing. That's the firmest rule in all of politics, that if you want to get something, you have to give up something, or vice versa. So they would be doubling the weight of their vote and giving up the veto in return. So that's the ultimate solution of a weighted voting system. But apart from that, you could say that no country could use the veto, and these could be gentlemen's agreements, which would gradually take hold. No country could use the veto in a case in which it is itself a party to the dispute. That no country could cast a veto without giving the legal brief stating why, under international law, that veto was justifiable. Today, countries cast veto, and they're not accountable. They say, I don't like it, I veto it. And they say, well, and everybody accepts it because that's been the norm since the UN was founded. So if you say you can have a veto, but you can't have a veto without having a good, sound legal reason for the veto, that would do it. You could say that that you could have a requirement for at least 2 negative votes, say in what's called the Chapter 7. That's the use of force for peacekeeping. That you'd have to have at least 2 countries voting a certain way to in a Chapter 7 legal proceeding, calling for the use of force. And there are various modifications. There's a lot written on how to deal with a veto. So it's not, again, people throw out there and say, oh, it's a veto, we can't change it. Why? Because they haven't been using their head, thinking of ways by which to change it. The word can't, we ought to get it out of our vocabulary. There's very little we can't do if we have the mind to do it. So.
Very well said. I love that can should be out of our vocabulary.
And another word that you should shun is never. Try never to say never, because if you believe that, you're stuck. You have to believe that you can. In order to be able to do something, you have to believe that it's possible. You might not succeed, but if you believe that it's impossible, you're surely not going to succeed.
I think I should move towards conclusion right here with these nice words. So if I say, what message would you like to give to public in general and youth in particular, other than the one which you give right away?
What would I like to give?
Any message to public in general or youth in particular?
Well, you have to be concerned about your fellow human being. I think that most species are, and the human species sometimes is, but often is not. And I think it's an imperative that we have to care about other people, and unless we do, we're going to have conflict.
Thank you, Professor Joe, and we are very happy to be with you. And as I said, you are the first one whom we are interviewing here.
My
Thank
pleasure.
you very much.